So today, Jessica and I were welcoming Nanine McCool to our video recording of the podcast. Nanine came across certainly my radar because of her interactions with Tony Robbins nearly a year ago now. And since then, I've heard a lot about her views and her experience, which just really struck me as amazing aspects of leadership. And since what we're exploring is leadership, not just leadership today, but what do today's leaders need to be great leaders tomorrow? And so that's what we're going to be exploring. So Nanine, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us. Thank you. So I think that for those followers of Tony Robbins, the experience was one that probably a lot of people are aware of. But I think it would be worth just exploring that whole experience.
Sure. It's almost been a year now. It's so funny that just kind of flown by. But so it was about a year ago this time that I just got this kind of crazy idea that I wanted to go to a Tony Robbins seminar. I knew who he was. I'd always had a positive opinion of him, but I'd never bought one of his books. I just sort of seen clips from him on YouTube. So it wasn't like I was this, a huge follower, but I was impressed with him. And I thought it was in the business I am with my husband, we're transitioning. I thought, well, maybe I can go to the seminar and get some insight and grow up in some leadership abilities. And so I went to, the seminar was in California, San Jose. And it was the very first day. It's like a rock concert. I had no idea that it was going to be that,
10,000 people.
Yeah, it was, I was surprised. And I had decided to go all out and buy the most expensive ticket and be on the floor, down on the ground level where he walks around. And it started, and from the start, he would say things that I found cringeworthy about the male-female dynamic. They struck me as very outdated, but I just thought, like anyone, you go and you take the good and you leave the rest. And but there were a few things that really bothered me, and we moved on. And then somewhere in the middle of the day, he started talking about, and his name just escaped me.
Will someone, wasn't it?
No, he was the big casino magnate who had just been accused by lots of women of sexual harassment and sexual exploitation in the workplace. It was kind of in the news at the time. And he started talking about that. Steve Wynn, that's who it was. Steve Wynn, big magnate over here. And I really didn't know who Steve Wynn was. And so I was trying to figure out how he was piecing this together, and he segued into what a great guy Steve Wynn was, into talking about the Me Too movement. And it wasn't the first time he'd mentioned the movement. But for whatever reasons, this time I was sitting in my seat on the first floor, and he was way across this huge arena, and I just found myself on my feet yelling at him, saying, not yelling at him as in, angrily, but yelling across the arena to get his attention, like, you've got it wrong, you don't understand, you just don't understand. And then at some moment I came to myself and thought, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And tried to sit down, but by then, one of the people that follow him around with microphones had found me and handed me a microphone. And then we had the famous interaction that Butterscotch, who happened to just pull out her phone and record it, she caught it almost from the beginning. And it was a surreal experience, still is. I was hoping that was optimistic from the start that this was going to be a learning experience, that he was going to challenge me and to, help me see things from a different perspective. But the interaction just turned out to be very disappointing, from my point of view of how enlightened Tony Robbins isn't about, the Me Too movement and what it's about in women's experience in the workplace.
Well, I think we're really keen to know what's happened for you in the year that's gone past, but I guess I just wanted to throw in a quote that I came across when I was preparing for this interview, which was from the Dalai Lama, and it's, "When you talk, you are only repeating what you already know, but if you listen, you may learn something new." And it just really resonated with your experience there, because I just think sometimes when people get into these positions of authority and people look to them for that wisdom and insight, perhaps you stop thinking that you've got something to learn, and you gave him an opportunity to listen, and perhaps he didn't take it, and then he didn't allow himself to learn and grow and develop, which is probably the very thing that he promotes to people to do.
I'd like to think that perhaps in a different setting, different day, he might have responded differently. I think for whatever reasons, I caught him at his worst, and everybody has a bad day. I am disappointed that in the aftermath, there hasn't been more from him, but maybe he's still involved in that learning process. I mean, it's not something you're going to take in overnight, particularly when people are asking you to step back and see yourself from an entirely different perspective, and probably one that's not as flattering as you would like it to be. So, but it was interesting to me that in that interaction, he seemed genuinely angry, which was surprising to me. And
and that's one of the things that really struck me was in watching that video of the interaction between the two of you. It seemed to me that it sort of metaphorically, he was acting out what is going on in a lot of organizations where leaders are challenged, and that the only sort of the knee-jerk reaction is one of power. How can I, because I'm uncomfortable, because I've been taken into a place that, I mean, you can speculate whether that he was triggered in some way, but he was uncomfortable, and his resistance exercise with you, which in different circumstances could make an awful lot of sense, in the way that he acted that out with you, just seemed completely wrong in the moment. I mean,
sent the wrong message.
You're 5'8" or whatever you are, but he's 6'7", so he's 11 inches taller than you, and he's a big man at the best of times. So that I mean, it's one of the things that really struck me about you and your courage. I mean, you were just in an experience, but I shouldn't think that there was all sorts of parts of you saying, "Run, let's go away from this." And yet he was using an exercise, as I say, in other circumstances it would have been fine, but it wasn't fine there, and it did seem like a metaphor for something much bigger.
Yeah, and in an odd sort of way to me, that he proved my point in choosing that particular interaction. And I do think that what he acted out there is exactly what I've experienced, perhaps not, literally, but certainly, the dynamic is very much the same from the time I was in the military, and I experienced that sort of, I'll be nice to you as long as you don't challenge me, and I'll be nice to you so long as you play the role that I expect of you. But if you try to step out of that and, express yourself genuinely, then there are always consequences, and they usually involve using power in a way that, I think is not really how power is expected to be used in those situations. So I agree with you. And I do think that the pushing exercise, I had never watched him do that. I didn't know what he was doing. He told me to put my fist up. So I put my fist up like this, then he turned my wrist. And I was clueless as to what was going to happen. So as it played out, I kept thinking, okay, this is going to turn into something positive. And of course, by the time it was over, I was just, you know, I was at the point where, okay, there's nothing positive coming out of this. You know, he really doesn't get it, which was stunning to me. Although I guess it shouldn't be, but it was.
Yeah. This is such a repeating story in so many different guises. And you know,
and I think it's important for us to acknowledge, for me to acknowledge, and it's clear to me often daily here that I am also a product of the culture that creates that dynamic, and I have internalized a lot of it myself. So it's unpleasant for me to confront within myself the same tendencies about men and women, particularly in the workplace, that I myself have come across. And it's sobering to realize that, you know, it's not as easy as saying, oh, you know, men have all the power and so they're the problem. It really is a cultural issue that we are all affected by it. And it's frustrating to me, the level that I have become a part of that very system that, you know, marginalizes anybody who's, in my country anyway, white male, and I'm sure most of the Western country. I mean, it's frustrating that how insidious it is. Because the industry that we work in, my husband owns a construction company, and now there are three of us are partners in it, and there are no women in this industry. You know, I'm in the administrative part of it. I don't do the actual construction work because they climb towers, and I'm deathly afraid of heights. But I think women would make great climbers. I can't get any to come in. I can't get a lot of applicants. But even when someone puts in an application, I'm immediately struck with this overarching sense of, oh my gosh, if I hire one woman, it's going to be a problem. It's horrible that I catch myself thinking those things, because I myself was on the other end of that when I was in the military, in a, you know, slightly different. But, you know, it really is something that as we need to work on together, which was one of the things I hoped would come out of the Tony Robbins things, that it created a discussion where we could all talk about our role in it. And I don't know if that discussion's still ongoing, but it's a big problem.
So are you still being invited to kind of comment on that experience, or was it sort of a short-lived thing that you're invited onto different TV and?
I get invitations occasionally, not nearly as often as initially. And I kind of, after about a week of it, I sort of shut it down and said, you know, I'm really tired of talking about this. And the media has its own sort of dark side. I'm not an anti-media person. You know, media is important. But there is the whole, let's jump on the latest bandwagon and, you know, make our mark. So I did kind of shut it down after a while. But, you know, I always maintain the attitude that if it's something that can help perpetuate an important and meaningful conversation, then I am happy. I want to be part of that conversation. But, you know, if it's just, let's rehash the whole thing, it's kind of boring.
Yeah. Are you aware of any spaces where these conversations about cultural narratives are being had in America? Because I think when I was watching the clip, what I was trying to understand if there was anything good in what he was saying, and whether there was this tension between his kind of philosophy of we can change our lives, you know, we have that power. And I think what I felt like you were trying to say is that it's not about necessarily, we do have to change ourselves, but we have to change the cultural narrative as well. And that's perhaps much more complex, and that the Me Too movement is about changing the cultural narrative through women feeling empowered to change their own narratives or speak out or think about things differently. And so I think the trouble with a lot of this personal development stuff is it stays very much within the I, and it doesn't look at the we, and it doesn't ask those challenging questions to a broader cultural narrative that is at so many layers and so many intersections and takes in all of us. So have you kind of tried to find a space where you can have those conversations?
I do, and obviously I don't go out, and I think initially I started and tried to, you know, get people together to talk about it, but you know, it's time consuming. I hate to say it. And the interesting, it's so divisive in many ways that it was hard to maintain a civil conversation, you know, and this is on Facebook, obviously, because trying to get a group together in my community is not likely to happen, because where I live in the South, very conservative traditional values here. But it is difficult because I think for a lot of reasons, but what I experienced was it quickly devolved into stereotypes and people separating into their own camps, and a difficulty in looking inward to understand how what someone else is saying to us could, you know, isn't necessarily an indictment of us, but is an opportunity to sort of rethink our own, you know, perspective, that there is another side to our perspective. How someone else understands and hears us is an important part of communication that I think gets lost. But it's difficult to have that conversation, I think, because, you know, at least over here, nuance is not much appreciated. And, you know, it's much easier to slap a label on something and jump on your team side and, you know, root to win, even if the prize is, you know, more discord and more divisiveness. But it's difficult to have that conversation. And I would, you know, when I have these opportunities, I'm always engaged, because it is an opportunity to hear different perspectives and learn something myself. But I don't think them out as much as I probably should.
Yeah, I'm going to say two things at once. I've got to sort of choose one or the other. In looking at the comments on sort of some of the Twitter stuff and the Facebook live feeds, I got the impression that there were a lot of men who were making excuses for Tony Robbins.
A lot of women too.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Was it balanced or not? Because I don't know whether I was just looking at through biased eyes in my just myself. Was it balanced?
That's my impression, that I probably actually might have heard from more women than I did from men. And I think that's not necessarily a statement about, you know, that there's more women who, that, you know, I don't think it's actually an objective evaluation of where it lies. I just think women are more willing to speak out against a woman. And I think men sort of feel like, well, that's, you know, we'll let the women hash that out because they're women. I do think it's part of that. But no, I got quite a bit of pushback from men and women. And some of the women were just as nasty as some of the men. You know, it was, and obviously I got great comments from a lot of men. And I certainly heard more great comments from women. Overwhelmingly, the positive comments came from women. But the negative comments were pretty much evenly split between men and women.
Interesting. So you, one of the things that really resonates for me around you is the importance of justice for you.
And justice for all. They taught me the Pledge of Allegiance when I was 4 years old, and I really thought it meant something.
For me, there's a distinction between justice and right, and it's based on this idea that justice is formed in the courts. It's formed by people, but right has a more elemental, a more fundamental,
more subjective.
Well, yes, and it's a good challenge. I guess my assumption is that if you really get down to it, it isn't that subjective. But I may just be a dreamer on that.
Yeah. For me, I used to, and I do think this is a reflection of, you know, the country I grew up in and the racial element of the system of government we have, the institutionalized racism, where I had the luxury of believing that what I believed was right, that was just a given, and that there was, there's man's law and God's law, and frankly, I'm not a believer in God anymore, but I was raised to believe in God. But there was that distinction that there is just what's right, and then there's what man can come up with justice. But I have grown to believe that what's right is very subjective, which is why justice is so important, because it does impose, or the goal, from my understanding of justice, was to impose rules that everybody knew were in place, so everybody could abide by those rules. And then if you broke the rules, there was a design system of addressing the violation that took the element of emotionalism and and argument out of it, making it as fair as any system run by men and women could be. But I no longer believe that right is as clear as I used to think it was. But that's me.
Yeah, I've been very influenced by Brian Stevenson and his work, with children on death row and so on. And, his reflections on, if you're Black, you're just so much less likely to have justice.
Right.
And that's wrong. That's just wrong. And
he may say this, I'm not familiar with him, but I think part of what resonates with me there is not only that if you're Black in this country, you're much less likely to get real justice. There are so many barriers, reasons for that they, at almost every step of the way, the whole game is rigged against you, so that the racism that's part of that is not overt. So people are quite comfortable saying, well, I'm not a racist. He got a fair deal. I treated him or her fairly. But because it's so entrenched in almost every level of our culture that it's almost invisible. And it's heartbreaking to me on a lot of levels. That something that is called justice is so unjust. It's offensive to me that you slap that label of justice on there and refuse to acknowledge all the different ways that it isn't.
Let me just ask one more question, and then I'll let you go, because we're just following a thing on this. We were very lucky last week to see Robin DiAngelo, who was in London. She's the author of that book, White Fragility, and Why It's So Difficult to Talk to White People About Racism. And it was fascinating. Her book is fascinating for so many reasons. One, because when you actually do talk, and she gave so many examples of just talking about racism to whites, and the whole default is based in a kind of sense of normality, that I'm white, therefore everybody else is different, and actually below me somehow, but they're brought up so they don't realize the water that, as a fish, they're swimming in. And what's been really interesting for me as we explored this is if you just delete white and insert male, you get exactly the same conversation. You became an attorney at law to deal with victims of domestic violence and abuse. So you were very driven by that, I assume.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that was the reason I went into law.
And so that, I'm sort of interested to hear that driver, and that need for that real need for justice, if you use that word.
Right. So I'm not sure where I do honestly remember the Pledge of Allegiance being very inspiring to me. I don't know if y'all know it, but it's I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, under God, with liberty and justice for all. And that last part, it just, whatever, it resonated with me. And I thought, okay, well, that's the country I live in. We're all about justice. And of course, I grew up in a blue working class family. I could see injustice around me, and I thought, and my mother taught us that, you have to you have to stand up for and be involved and give back and fight for what's right. She did teach us that. So, you know, I maybe that's where it came from, but it was always something I did and got me in trouble often, even as a child. It got me in trouble with my own mother, who like apparently wanted me to stand up for justice everywhere else, but not ever call her on it, which of course, as a teenager, we all do that. But I got into trouble in the military because of it. And I got into trouble in law school because of it. Not really trouble, but I brought probably more attention to myself than I would have cared for, because I was so willing to argue with certain professors about, you know, certain issues. And then when I got into law, I got into a lot of trouble over it. But it just, I've always felt like it's our patriotic duty to stand up for justice. And I also feel, as for people who, you know, talk about this word freedom, that it is our duty to challenge authority and and keep power in check. Because if you submit to power and never challenge it, never question it, well, it's naturally just going to continue to grow. So I just thought it was, you know, just part of my obligation as a citizen of this country, to keep this country strong. I had an obligation to stand up for justice and to do that. And going to law school was a way to learn the law and learn how to help a particularly vulnerable population, which, you know, even then I knew that they had a rough time in the justice system. I had no idea how really bad it was and continues to be. So, you know, I just felt like it was what I was supposed to do. And still do to some degree.
Very inspiring. But challenging. Yeah, but I think also, like, it goes back to your point about the nuance. You know, how can you have these conversations in a country in the same way that in England we have our colonial history that very often doesn't get spoken about in an open, honest way? It's the same thing of these Western powers and facing what we've done to marginalized people throughout hundreds of years. And until that story is told in a different way and those people are given voice and we hear them and we confront the pain, I don't know if we'll ever really progress much further.
Yeah, I do agree, and I confront this more and more, because, you know, that indoctrination which occurs to everyone, you know, into the culture that you're born into, and then over here, very much that, you know, the Anglo-Saxon roots that we brought over here, this white, you know, Protestant, whatever, I'm not Protestant, but, you know, that identity made us right and justified in our history. You know, it was okay to slaughter all the indigenous people because, you know, we're white, and it was our right, and God has blessed us with this power and this authority, and everyone, it's, you know, that's the way I was raised. And it just, as I grew up and I matured and still am, right, this whole process of understanding what white privilege is and trying and starting to understand how, you know, that has affected my life and how I've had these advantages, and understanding my part in the system, it's unpleasant. Like, talking to white people about white privilege and racism is painful. It's painful to me. And I wish there was a little more patience. I recognize that that's being white privilege, asking for more patience, but it's it is just, it's not anything you're going to do overnight. It's not something that somebody's going to come to you and say, hey, you're part of the problem, and because of this white privilege thing, and people are going to say, oh yeah, okay, good, I believe you. It is something that takes time and an ability to be introspective, which I don't think is a skill everyone has. But that the idea that we're right because we're white is almost fundamental. It's almost in my DNA. And it is a struggle to recognize when that's coming into play in my own life, because it's so subtle. I'm suddenly in the middle of an argument with someone and I'm just insisting that I'm right. And there's finally a voice in my head that'll say, but why are you so sure you're right? And a lot of times it's because I expect this person to agree with me for some reason or another. What their role, it might have something to do with the color of their skin. That's still just so hard for me to suss out, that at least I'm asking the question, I guess. At least I have that little bit of awareness that it's like, which is what brought me to the idea that right is not always so clear. What we think of as right can be very subjective. And, it is important to step back and look at your context of right and what does that exclude and what does that, internalize. And now I'm way off in the nuance, obviously. But it's a difficult process, and I think it's an even more difficult conversation that we still need to have. I think it's incredibly important to have those conversations, and it's not going to change unless we have the conversations and we allow ourselves to have the conversations. And I'm rambling, but I do want to say that and you may want to cut it from this eventually, but one of the most frustrating issues for me was recently the whole controversy over blackface. And I absolutely respect the fact that that is offensive. It's just like using, certain terms that are offensive, and people say, oh, well, I don't mean it that way. And I've always been, well, but it offends people. So why do you have to use it? And I've adopted the same attitude about blackface. I can't possibly understand what that means. And I don't fully understand, I do understand some of it, but I don't understand every context of it. But I just accept it's offensive. So I don't need to do it, and I'm not going to defend it. But the discussion that evolved around that was, I thought, very useful, but it keeps getting shut down. Like Megyn Kelly tried to start that discussion, and she got shut down and left her show because she tried to have a discussion about it. And I don't think that's useful. I think when white people engage in these behaviors that need to be talked about and need to have a different perspective of, we got to have the discussion. We can't demonize people simply because they are admitting. Like Liam Neeson just admitted that, he had these horrible reaction to a woman he knew who was raped by apparently a black man. And so he wanted to go out and do violence against any black man. And in that process, he was acknowledging how awful that was. And yet he's been excoriated for having said it. And I don't understand how we're ever going to get through this if we don't allow people to admit their failings and then talk about that process. It's frustrating to me, but it's also very ironically more evidence of how we're all just so much more alike than we are different, because the need to come out on top and to be right and to minimize and diminish people based on some arbitrary characteristic is in all of us. It's there. It's just that I don't want to trade white racism for black racism or brown racism or female matriarchy for male patriarchy. I just want us to work towards the middle of how can we be more respectful, and maybe it's not possible. Maybe it's the discussion that matters. I don't know. Sorry for rambling.
No, it's a very good ramble and a very easy to follow ramble, because I think it reflects so much of the things that we spent doing last year in having dialogue spaces for people to really be able to see and hear different perspectives and to be able to voice those assumptions and those biases in a place of non-judgment. Because you're completely right. We all carry assumptions and biases, all of us, because we only have our own limited experience of the world. And then when we get in a room of non-judgment and we can share those experiences, that's when we can start to change in a condition that really supports positive change by allowing us just to listen and voice and understand and grow. And we just don't have many of those spaces anywhere, I think, in the world right now. We're so about judgment and blame and criticism to reinforce power structures. And that was something else I wanted to maybe talk to you about, was about the language that we use and how that reinforces labels or power structures or different types of relationships. Because obviously around sexual assault and abuse, are you a survivor? Are you a victim? Are you a target? That language which can be very meaningless to someone who maybe hasn't experienced something. But when you are the person who's experienced something, that language becomes very powerful. And how do we navigate that, not knowing who we might trigger or what language we should use or shouldn't use? It is tricky.
Yeah, and this is another area where I get kind of frustrated, which is it's also a very personal experience, right, to be a victim. And how we each individually process that, how we experience it, how we get through it or don't get through it, very, very personal. I am triggered by certain things that I know I'll be triggered by, so I've learned to avoid them, which is probably not the best best strategy. I should probably confront them. But I don't, like Tony Robbins triggered me, right? He's a huge guy. I mean, you don't have any, I had no concept of how big he is until he's standing right in front of you. And also because I'm a tall woman, so I don't generally experience that there's someone who can overpower me physically like that so easily, you know. And that triggered me, but I don't hold him responsible for that. How is he supposed to know? He doesn't know me. He doesn't know what my experience. So I think there's a certain level of we need to allow people to, I think we need to be more willing to speak up and say, hey, don't do that. And this is something I learned in the service, actually, was to say, don't say that to me. Don't say that in front of me. I find that offensive. And I would declare that so that people would know. Because we make a lot of assumptions, right? About people do it all the time. I live in the South. I'm white. People make a lot of assumptions about what my politics are or, you know, what my racial attitude is. And very often, well, not very often anymore, but because it's so much less acceptable. But very often in my youth, I would have to tell people, don't use that language around me. You know, don't say that to me. I don't agree with that. So they would know I'm not part of that club and I don't want to be part of your club. But, you know, nowadays, if you say something that someone else finds offensive, it's almost, I mean, we just don't allow people to have a discussion and this idea of who's a victim. And I think we've demonized the word victim and it bothers me. It inherently, I carry all the shame around about every time somebody said, oh, she's a victim or he's a victim, I would feel this internal shame of, well, that's not me. I'm not going to be a victim, you know, because of the way they're talking about it. And I don't want to do that. So I'm absolutely happy to say, yes, I am a victim of sexual abuse. I'm a victim of sexual harassment. I'm a victim of domestic violence in my own home growing up. I'm a victim of those things. And I guess what I've made that word mean to me is something entirely different from what we've used it to mean, I think, more broadly in the culture, which is something shameful. For me, it is just a fact. That happened to me. And the fact that I was a victim means somebody else's shame, not mine. But other people, you know, they use the word to mean it in a, well, poor you, you're a pathetic creature. And I just reject it. But I do think that people who have been victimized have to find their own way through that. They have to define for themselves how they want to process that and get through it. And ultimately, you know, that is the objective, to get through it. And whatever you have to do, however you have to compartmentalize and understand what happened to you so that you can grow through it and beyond it, I think that's up to each individual. And I'm off track, I'm sorry. But I do want to make the point that saying, oh, you're acting like a victim, I absolutely reject that. I think that's the absolute abuse of that term. You're acting like a victim. Because what they're really actually trying to do is telling someone you were refusing to hold yourself accountable. Because every time I hear that term used that way, they're telling someone who is truly making excuses for something they've done wrong and won't take responsibility for it. And that's an entirely different thing than being a victim. Because when you're a victim, you are absolutely not responsible for what happened to you. Someone else has done something to you. So to use that word to tell someone, take responsibility for your own choices, is an abuse of the term, my opinion.
Yeah.
There is also the element, and I know this in myself, if I hear the victim in someone else, it's very easy to trigger me in remembering the abuse that I went through,
And the shame of being a victim.
and so I try and reject it, and I will make them wrong because I don't want them to make me feel. You know, it's not what's happening, but because of how they are, it takes me into a place where I feel disempowered, or I feel bad, and I don't want that. And that happened in me for a long time unconsciously.
Yes. I think it still happens to me unconsciously, and not necessarily in the sexual abuse area where I've just become very good at processing that, but you know, in the sort of legal abuse area, I think I still struggle with that. Something I hadn't even considered, but I do think because I was all smug with myself for being, you know, so good at managing the sexual abuse aspects of being victimized. I didn't think about how that also plays out in other areas of our lives where, you know, we suffer some huge wrong and then don't want to go back there. I think I'm still very much in the midst of that.
And it really comes back to the nuance, because we have certain cultural narratives that label the victim, that are very clear, and like you said, other experiences that are very personal that we don't often realize the effects that they have on us, and what we can carry around, and therefore then what we start to get triggered by or project onto others, and that again comes back to why we need to just sit and listen to each other and be in dialogue, so that we can start to notice our own thought patterns and inquire into why am I feeling that, why am I thinking that, where is that coming from. And I think that's a real theme that's woven through our conversations today, is just stopping and becoming aware, and then being able to question, and then being able to share that in a way that you don't feel the judgment or shame of others, so that we can all grow.
Yeah, and that's, you know, I'm sitting here thinking of that, how that process, like you said, sometimes we're not aware of it, and the first thing that came to my mind was how good I am at compartmentalizing, and that I think is sort of one side of the story that I tell myself, which is I'm really good at compartmentalizing, and if you're going to mess with my compartmentalization, I'm going to shut you down. If you're going to try to go in there and open up one of those boxes I've put away, I'm going to shut you down. And you know, I recognize that differently in helping and talking to people about, you know, child sexual abuse, but actually I realized in processing being disbarred that I had used that in many ways to work on my own issues, to sort of make, you know, how you can't fix what happened to you in the past, but you can try and make it right in the present. So I think there was a part of that where I was avoiding my own pain and my own trauma by trying to help others with theirs. So there was that element as well. And then I am really good at compartmentalization. It's a little bit distressing sometimes how good I am at it, but I do recognize in myself that resistance when someone is trying to, or even not trying, they're just trying to talk to me about something, and for whatever reasons it's knocking on one of those closed doors, and that tendency to want to shoo them off, like take charge of the conversation and redirect it in a way that's safe for me, but not necessarily what they want. Yeah, I still do that.
And do you have, I mean, you obviously have an awareness of this, but do you have any practices that you do, like meditation or spending time in nature or yoga, anything that you do that you find helps you in this process, this lifelong journey of processing and developing and growing?
Honestly, I write. I used to write a lot in my journal, and I've always found that very helpful. You know, just writing your thoughts out, and then for whatever reasons, it's like it forces you to have a conversation with yourself. And I've always found that really helpful. I do try to meditate, but I'm really terrible at it. It's just, it is, yeah. If I can get through 10 minutes of sitting still and not, being completely overwhelmed by the madness in my head, I've done well. And, but I write mostly, and I garden for sanity.
Yeah.
And I'm not good at gardening either. Like, I kill stuff right and left, but there's something about being out there and with, your hands in the dirt, and it's just soothing to me.
Yeah. And
but
again,
the process of, I write, and if I can have regular conversations with smart people, that helps me as well. But right now, I don't allow enough time for that. My sister is really just scary smart, and we sometimes have these really good conversations, and that's good for me because she gets nuance really well, but I don't get to talk to her enough either. So that's me. I'm very verbal, if you hadn't noticed.
But just going back to the gardening comment, I think again it's a reflection of these somewhat invisible cultural narratives. It's like, well, why do you have to be good at something that you really enjoy?
Oh, that's an excellent point. I guess I always feel like when I say I garden, people are going to say, "Oh, well, I bet you have a beautiful garden," and I'm thinking, no, lots of dead stuff in there.
But the process of it is meaningful to you. So.
It is. So yeah, I do it. And you're right. I don't have to be good at it. Good thing.
Where do you see power going, and how can we be more enlightened in the way that we live in this place where it's just so easy to lash out?
It is the irony to me that over here, and I'm sure that the rhetoric may be different, but the values are the same. This idea of egalitarianism and individuality and justice for all. Within that, it has become nothing but rhetoric, and what we really have been indoctrinated into in some way is an idea that power is the ultimate goal. And I understand my frustration with the current leadership in this country is that it's about winning at all costs. And that's from the ground up, right? The leaders we have currently reflect something that's going on at a much more fundamental level. I've been saying that for years, that the problem is not up there, the problem is down here. And we have become lazy and don't want to think for ourselves. We want to join a group that already has a set narrative that we can just adopt as our own, and then we want to go out and win every argument. And it's not about logic, and it's not about facts, or even nuance. It's about, this is the rhetoric, it's my rhetoric, and I'm not going to back off of it until I've beaten you into submission however I can. And that includes literally beating people into submission in some circles. And I don't think that we're going, I think that's probably a theme that our governments have tried to address through laws and constitutions, and that people continually lose sight of that lesson. That if we're left to our own instincts, our instincts are going to be to beat everybody into submission or join whichever leader we think can do it for us. But there is an unwillingness to think for ourselves. There is a need to be right. And I may be using that word differently than you use it, but to have your idea be unchallenged, not even to come out on top in the argument, but to actually absolutely brook no challenge. And I find that abhorrent, and nothing I am ever, hopefully, will ever just accept is that I'm not allowed to say, I disagree. And but that, I think that's where our leadership now is. No matter what we say about what good leaders are, I think internally people gravitate towards the biggest brute in the room, and that's where we are. And in our own very small organization, we're 20 of us. It's still very challenging to be at the top of an organization like of just 20 and be the leader that I would like to be, and to behave in conformity with the ideals I say, I believe in, because I think is too much. It's too easy for us to not do the hard work of embracing the ideals of whatever ideals are, instead of just devolving in the moment to, well, I can hurt you in some way because I have more power than you, so I'm going to use my power to hurt you because I can, not because it's justice, but because I have that power and I can use it and no one can stop me. So I think we have to stop thinking of winning and want to be more engaged in understanding and compromise and collaboration. And I don't see any support for that over here in this country, particularly right now. Very demoralizing.
Can we maybe end on a hopeful, where would you start, or what would you like to see happen? Or
education. I would start in our schools.
Yeah.
I would start in our schools, and interestingly, teach a lot more history, because we don't teach in a much more diverse history, not just the history of the winners, but the history of the losers. I would teach. We are failing our children by not teaching them properly, and that's where I would start.
Yeah, we have a movement to decolonize education, or decolonize lots of different aspects of our
that word, decolonize.
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't. We were the ones that were colonized according to our history. We are the victims in that, because the Brits were the problem. Now we're the best of the best. That's the underlying message that you get in school. Obviously, once you get older, you understand there's more nuance there. But that's sort of the game that gets played over and over again. That somehow we're always the ones that overcame the terrible savages, or the evil British government, and the crown that was whatever. That's the constant message that you get, what we got when we were kids. And we need to change that narrative to what colonization is and what it does, and the price that we all pay for it.
Absolutely. That's a powerful note to
Yes.
end on, I think.
Yes. Nanine, thank you so much.
Thank you for being amazing.
Yes.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing more of what y'all are doing.
Yeah.
Because leadership is something that I struggle with. It's not anything that was naturally to me. And I would say, for me personally, being a better leader requires patience.
Okay.
Yes.
But you can speak truth to power. So you're a different type of leader. Maybe you just need to think about the type of leader you want to become, not replicating the models of leadership you currently have.
Sometimes the hardest thing is speaking truth to your own power, right?
Yeah.
That's why people avoid it.
Yeah, but we are all powerful in our own way that doesn't need to impose on anyone else's power.
Well, I appreciate it. It was quite pleasant, and I look forward to seeing what y'all are doing more, and participating perhaps in more of what y'all do.
Yeah, we'd love to come and do a dialogue.
I would love to just learn from what y'all are doing, because I'm interested, and it's one of the things that is my challenge is to grow into a better leader. So that's what intrigued me about the invitation, was like, oh really? What are y'all doing? So I'm looking forward to seeing more of it. Thank Thank you for having me.
We'll keep you in touch, and good luck with wherever you go next. We'll follow with interest.
Well, I'll follow y'all with interest now too. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Y'all take care.